Hi, this is Ann from Finance on the Offense, and today I'm going to talk to you about the Dow Jones, the S&P 500, and the NASDAQ. All right, let's get started. Now, I'm sure you've heard all these terms before, but you're probably just wondering what exactly are they? So let's start with the most popular one, the Dow Jones. The Dow Jones is actually a company, but when you hear about the Dow or the DJIA, how it's referred to on the web a lot, they're just referring to the Dow Jones Industrial Average, which is different than the company. Now, before we get too far into this video, I want to say that none of this is investing advice. I'm just a random person on the internet, so take it all with a grain of salt. But I did my best to research all of these topics. And in return, I hope you'll do your best to smash that like button for the YouTube algorithm. That would be extremely awesome. All right, back to the Dow. The whole goal of the Dow is to provide a big picture view of whether the stock market is going up or down at any given moment. But the weird thing is it only tracks 30 companies. Because it's just tracking a few companies, it's also known as an index. So the idea is if those 30 companies are doing really well, then the whole stock market must be doing really well. That's also why everyone freaks out when the Dow is falling. If those 30 companies are doing poorly, then that must mean this whole stock market is doing badly. So why does it only have 30 companies? Well, it was created by the Dow Jones Company in 1896, and back then there just weren't that many stocks on the stock market. There were more than 30, but it was probably a little too hard to track them all like we can easily do today. Now there are about 3,800 companies on the stock market, which is a lot to track, but we have computers, so it's not that big a deal. As of August 2020, the companies in the Dow, those 30 companies, have changed 55 times since 1896. So basically, if a company is doing badly for long enough, it'll fall off the list, and another company that's been doing better will jump onto the list. General Electric was on the list the longest. It was on the original list in 1896, and it only fell off the Dow in 2018. So let's take a look at these 30 companies that make up the list. As you can see, there are some pretty big names on this list. 3M, McDonald's, Caterpillar, Boeing, Nike. And when I was researching this video, I read through all of these companies, and there are only about 3 that I didn't know. So it makes sense that if all of these companies were doing really badly, the whole stock market and economy are probably doing badly too. Or if these companies are doing great, the rest of the economy is doing great too. But that doesn't necessarily have to be the case, and COVID is a great example of that. Back in March 2020, COVID really was taking off and the stock market took a huge plunge. Tons of companies were on lockdown, everybody was sheltering in place and quarantining. So let's look at the Dow Jones in March of 2020. Right here in February of 2020, the Dow was at 29,398. Then COVID happened. And as you might have guessed, here in mid-March, we are down to about 19,000. Also in April, the unemployment rate went from about 4% in January of 2020 to almost 15% in April. Now the Dow Jones recovered really quickly. It had completely recovered by November of 2020. But the unemployment rate was still at almost 7% that month. And it still hasn't completely recovered a year later. It's at 6% right now in April 2021. Meanwhile, the Dow has surged to all-time highs. So the Dow doesn't necessarily always match what's happening in the economy and with unemployment. But generally speaking, the economy tends to follow what the Dow is doing. So when people ask, how did the stock market do today? They're most likely talking about the Dow Jones Industrial Average. It's the most widely used index out there. And as I said earlier, it's the most popular benchmark to tell how the stock market is doing. But there are other indexes that are used as benchmarks too. Next up is the S&P 500. The S&P 500 tracks 500 stocks. So to me, this one seems like it would be a little more accurate than the Dow Jones, which only tracks 30 stocks. But even though I believe that, I still check the Dow instead, and so does everybody else. Anyway, S&P 500 stands for Standard & Poor's 500. It was introduced in 1957, so it's much newer. And it works pretty much the same way. When one of those companies on the list of 500 stocks does badly, it'll fall off and a new stock will come on. Tesla, the car company, jumped onto the S&P 500 in December of 2020. And whenever this happens, it's kind of like a company joining the major leagues. So investors say, oh hey, that company must be legit because it just got onto the S&P 500. So they get really excited about the stock and they buy a bunch of it, and that drives the price up. When Tesla joined the S&P 500 in December, their stock went from about $650 a share to $880 a share in January. And now it's falling a little back down. So joining an index like the S&P 500 can be a big deal for a stock's price. And that's just if you want to believe that, joining the S&P 500 had anything to do with that huge rise in price. Maybe people just like the stock. So yes, the S&P 500 is just another indicator of how the stock market and the economy is doing. During the craziness that was 2008, the S&P 500 fell almost 58% between October 2007 and March 2009. So yeah, it's a pretty good indication that things are not going well in the economy. There's one other index that I'm going to talk about today, and that's the NASDAQ Composite. That index only tracks stocks that are on the NASDAQ, so it's not going to include anything that sells on the New York Stock Exchange. The NASDAQ includes more than 2,500 companies, international and domestic, but it's not nearly as popular a benchmark as the Dow Jones or the S&P 500. Basically, the goal of all three indexes is to give a representation of what the stock market is doing as a whole. But each index has different ways of trying to do that. They each have different criteria for picking what companies should come onto the index and which ones should go off the index. There are just a lot of different factors involved. So although it doesn't happen very often, there are days here and there where one index will go up and another index will go down. But that makes sense because they're not exactly the same and they have different criteria for everything they do. All right, I hope this video has been helpful for you. If you like this video and you want to see more videos like it, just hit the subscribe button and the little bell next to it, and you'll be notified every time a new video comes out. All right, I'll see you in the next video. Thank you.